Risk comes in all kinds of flavors. In part 2, we'll assess our risk of harm. Fair warning, that part's pretty gnarly. First, let's evaluate our financial risk. This part's just wild. The best way to approach this is to underwrite the government as if it were a corporation, which, according to many people, including General Milley, is exactly what it is.
Transparency, you're the board of directors for this corporation called the American government.
Corporation called the American government.
I have no idea what the actual story is there. I've barely peeked into that rabbit hole, and we're not going to get into it here, but I thought it was interesting enough to mention. A full underwrite would be boring, and it's not necessary for this purpose, so we are going to simplify this section and make it fun since the next part is sad.
Before we go to part 2, let's revisit part 1, but this time with Sage. Would you invest in a company that was $20 trillion in debt? In actuality, it's $30 trillion. I don't remember mortgaging my country.
Angry Girl era was fall of 22, so...
And it's not like we bought the place.
Okay, past me, calm down. If we update these numbers, current national debt is $34.6 trillion.
It might be okay if the company is making money.
Before we try to fathom how much $34 trillion even is, past me's got a point. When it comes to debt, it's not necessarily the size that matters. It's about the motion of the ocean, or cash flow. We can be adults and call this ability to repay, or ATR, because in the industry we don't like to use full words. To do this, we're going to head over to the Congressional Budget Office and grab the data from 2023, and then slide it over into a less stupid graph so we can compare our income to our expenses. I promise to keep this simple, so our ability to repay hinges on our income being more than our expenses. When our expenses exceed our income, we cannot pay them back, so we do not meet ATR requirements, and as you can see, that is the case here. This difference here is what we call a deficit, which is like overdrawing our bank account, which is what we did last year, by $1.7 trillion. Okay, but that was past us. Maybe we've turned over a responsible leaf in 2024. Nope. Current deficit is $828 billion. And just kidding, it updated again this month. It is now $1.06 trillion. So our 2024 bank account is now overdrawn by $1.06 trillion. There is no motion in our ocean, so we're back to size matters. Which was actually kind of a lie anyway. Size kind of does matter when you're a country, and let me show you why. Keep this $34 trillion number in mind. This is a chart of M2. It includes physical currency, bank holdings, and near liquid assets. So cash, checking accounts, savings accounts, it's the Fed's estimate of the total money supply. The numbers are in billions, so they're trillions, and when we slide this thing on over to 2024... Uh-oh is right, G-dubs. That's $20.78 trillion, and if you're tracking, that means that our debt is more than 1.5 times the total supply of money. Let's bring back our easy graph, and the pink bar is bigger than the blue bar, which means we owe all the money that there is, and then another $13.8 trillion. That doesn't exist. So that these and these can exist. Before we talk about the other things that our tax dollars are putting us into debt to create, let's talk about credibility. Whether we're evaluating a borrower for a loan or a business to invest in or an agency to offload authority to, even a potential boyfriend or girlfriend, step 1 is to discern credibility. i.e. past behavior predicts future behavior. So here we want to analyze past data and look at trends and patterns versus isolated events. This chart here shows federal debt held by the public from 1974 to last year, which the Congressional Budget Office chose to show as a percentage of GDP, probably so it didn't look like this, which is a chart that shows a history of federal debt from 1970 to 2023 in just dollars. We can see it increases fairly steadily through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and around 2000, that increase starts to accelerate. To show this another way, your portion of this debt in 1990 was $12,818. In 2000, it was about $20,000. In 2010, it was $43,000. By 2020, you owed $80,000. 2022, you're up to $92,000. And as of today, you owe $102,833. And so do I, and so do all of our kids, which seems kind of weird to be born into $100,000 of debt in the freest country ever. Anyways, back to credibility. This is a deficit versus surplus chart from 1960 to 2023. It's like a 60-year history of managing our checking account. This line here is 0, so anything underneath it is overdrawn. So outside of this isolated incident here around 2000, it looks like we have a demonstrated history showing a pattern of spending money we don't have, as in both more than we make and more than even exists, and we're doing it at an accelerating pace. In less than 25 years, we've gone from each owing less than $20,000 to owing over $100,000. That's a 515% increase, and we had virtually no say what it was spent on.
$100,000 owed per household.
In 2014, professors from Princeton and Northwestern published a study on American politics. According to their research, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The conclusion of the paper was that the U.S. government was actually closer to an oligarchy than a democracy. Jennifer Lawrence and Represent Us made a video illustrating this issue, and we're going to borrow it because that's less work for me. So take any issue you really care about.
If there is zero support for a law, there's about a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. And if there is 100% support for something, there's still a 30% chance that Congress is going to pass it. Princeton determined that the preferences of the average American appear to have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy.
And this is far from an isolated finding. The Heritage Foundation, which is a big think tank in Washington, publishes an annual Index of Economic Freedom. Economic freedom meaning the fundamental right of every human to control his or her own labor and property. In an economically free society, individuals are free to work, produce, consume, and invest in any way they please. In economically free societies, governments allow labor, capital, and goods to move freely, and they refrain from coercion or constraint of liberty beyond the extent necessary to protect and maintain liberty itself. In the report, they rate and rank 184 countries based on how free they are. In their 2024 report, 4 countries scored high enough to be considered free. We are not one of them. To find us, you gotta scroll down to number 25, where we came in with a score of 70.1, which barely qualifies as mostly free and kind of feels like a freedom participation trophy. We scored in the 70s and 80s in a lot of metrics, but we got a little red problem here in the middle. Our government spending score was 48.7, which is probably generous, but our fiscal health came in at 0. Like actually 0, otherwise known as repressed. Here's how they describe the fiscal health category. Widening deficits and a growing debt burden, both of which are caused by poor government budget management, lead to the erosion of a country's overall fiscal health. Deteriorating fiscal health is associated with macroeconomic instability and economic uncertainty. They have an interactive graph where you can compare your country against other countries. So I picked some randoms to compare our fiscal health to. Let's do one of these maneuvers again. The blue line here is us, and the yellow line here is North Korea. We're the same. We came in last, and we are as macroeconomically unstable and as economically uncertain as North Korea. We appear to have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. To maintain intellectual honesty, this is already a fail. Radical irresponsibility with spending that is trending in the wrong direction is unacceptable and unsustainable. Our currency is becoming increasingly vulnerable, and we are one report away from being classified as moderately free. Failing to establish credibility creates too much risk to offload agency. But we're doing it anyway, so let's keep going. A corporation's objective is to make money, so next we would break down and validate income and expenses, but since the government takes our money, it's guaranteed until we stop giving it to them, so we can skip the income part and move straight to expenses to find out where the hell these trillions of dollars are going.
Show me the money.
According to fiscaldata.treasury.gov, the U.S. government has spent $3.25 trillion in fiscal year 2024, which is up $103 billion from this time last year, to ensure the well-being of the people of the United States.
According to the Constitution's preamble, the purpose of the federal government is to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
These goals are achieved through government spending. There are three main categories of government spending: mandatory, discretionary, and net interest. Mandatory spending includes Social Security and Medicare and programs that go to help people we actually know that live in our country. Interest is the pile of money we pay to keep the pile of debt we owe from defaulting. If you're a news watcher, you'll know that net interest is about to get a lot more expensive and is on pace to become our largest expense. Discretionary spending is the portion Congress gets to decide how to spend through federal appropriations. That's mostly what we're going to focus on. According to fiscaldata.treasury.gov, Congress generally allocates over half of the discretionary budget towards national defense. That means, according to our own government, over half of the funds allocated to be spent on the people of this country and the things they currently need is going towards the military. Last year, discretionary spending totaled $1.7 trillion, with $917 billion going to non-defense and $805 billion going toward defense, which is a little less than half, 46.7%. And it's also misleading. They sneak a bunch of military expenses into the mandatory category, and since military expenditures are a huge driver of the debt we're accumulating, that interest is theirs. This graph shows how the government portrays military spending. But when we portray it with intellectual integrity, it looks more like this, where military spending accounts for around 45% of total government outlays, not just discretionary spending. And I know this is hard to read. I'll link to it below. It's from warresisters.org. So fiscal data's graph of outlays versus revenue shown here, if we showed the portion going towards military spending, would look more like this. And no, this is not to scale. I'm just using Canva to make a point. And to make another point, despite half of our tax dollars going to the military, it's not going to enlistments, who get paid the equivalent of $11.64 per hour. So arguably that graph is still inaccurate because that's low enough to put their families on food stamps. That's like $1 an hour less than my 16-year-old son makes at the pizza place in the mall. It also feels kind of inhuman when you compare it to the $7.5 million taxpayers lay out each year for every member of Congress. The same Congress that doesn't care what we think. This is a National Priorities Project graphic illustrating how much the average taxpayer contributed towards militarism, with $1,750 going to Pentagon contractors, which is the average monthly rent in the country, maybe more than that. $32 going to mental health programs, Lockheed Martin getting $250, and K-12 education barely getting more than that at $350. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's a little ridiculous to me that we're investing almost as much in Lockheed Martin as we are in our children's education, which is like a tenth of what we're investing in the Pentagon. And speaking of the Pentagon, I think it's time to spice things up and bring back Angry Girl video.
In addition to that, they continue to lose trillions more every year. In a 3-year period, the DoD, Pentagon, couldn't account for $94 trillion. Trillion.
To put that into context, the entire global GDP for 2021 was also $94 trillion. And you probably remember that one time when Rumsfeld declared war against the Pentagon bureaucracy for losing $2.3 trillion the day before 9/11.
Come on, no one just loses trillions of dollars. That's crazy. Surely we could go through their books and figure it out. Nope, turns out this stellar investment keeps books that are not auditable. What the fuck? More sage. So despite the fact that these government agencies are required to keep track of their spending in order to be accountable to taxpayers, Pentagon underwent its first audit in 2018, failed miserably, and has been failing miserably ever since.
And miserably might be an understatement. Whilst failing their fifth audit in 2022, 1,600 auditors found that the department couldn't account for about 61% of its assets. In their most recent audit, failure number 6, that number increased to 63%, which comes out to just under $2.4 trillion. That number includes property and assets like buildings and partial F-35s.
Can we sage and sidebar? This is the Pentagon. Like, they're responsible for the entire security of our country, and they can't come up with an auditing system that can track their spending. Like, what?
YouTube made me delete the dope song I had here, so enjoy this piece of art instead. Okay, back to the Pentagon losing planes and buildings. Apparently, the GAO has flagged this issue for the department since at least 1981. GAO meaning the Government Accountability Office. Flagged meaning almost doing something about it. The issue being losing buildings and planes. And 1981 as in before I was born. For reference, I am 42. Maybe we should also audit the GAO, as it sounds like that might be another ridiculous thing that we're funding. All right, past me blew through that rather significant information pretty quickly, so let's circle back and review.
I have not had the opportunity to dig into that. I'll circle back, circle back, circle back. I hate to disappoint you. Circle back, circle back. That's an excellent question. Circle back, circle back. I hate to disappoint you, but we will venture to circle back.
Let's start with Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the United States Constitution, where it states, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time." Might be a little bit of a run-on, but it clearly states that federal appropriation expenditures be accounted for with receipts and published from time to time. Now let's jump in the time machine and travel back to the period shortly after the turn of the last century.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spend it on. They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in.
The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minnery's allegations.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went.
All right, let's jump back into our time machine to the year 2017, where instead of being closer to finding the missing $2.3 trillion, MSU Scholars find another $21 trillion unaccounted for. MSU Econ professor Mark Skidmore discovered the missing trillions in the federal budget from 1998 through the end of fiscal year 2015. Skidmore became interested after hearing a report that the Army had $6.5 trillion in unsupported adjustments in 2015. Given the Army's $122 billion budget, that meant the spending adjustments were 53 times the amount authorized by Congress. At first, he thought it was a mistake, and maybe the previous Assistant Secretary of HUD meant billions instead of trillions. But it wasn't, and after confirming the $6.5 trillion, Skidmore warned that the gargantuan nature of the undocumented federal spending should be a great concern to all taxpayers. He continued on to state, taken together, these reports point to a failure to comply with basic constitutional and legislative requirements for spending and disclosure, and then urged Congress to, do something about it. If you're into accounting, you know that adjustments are typically a fraction of spending, not multiples of spending. The government established requirements for the agencies to present financial statements back in the 90s, but for more than 20 years, the Department of Defense has lagged other agencies and essentially blown the requirement off. Despite obviously not giving a shit, the DoD had famously never been audited, even though they consistently seized the largest chunk of taxpayer dollars, receiving hundreds of billions of dollars annually and accumulating trillions in assets. Apparently, we've been allergic to accountability for a long time. Anyway, as chance would have it, 4 days after Skidmore's report started making noise, the Pentagon coincidentally announced its first ever audit of the DoD. The Defense Department is starting the first agency-wide financial audit in its history, the Pentagon's news service says, undertaking an immense task that has been sought, promised, and delayed for years. Almost sounds like accountability. Chief Pentagon spokesperson Dana White went on to claim, it demonstrates our commitment to fiscal responsibility and maximizing the value of every taxpayer dollar that is entrusted to us. Maybe we're getting somewhere. Beginning in 2018, our audits will occur annually, with reports issued November 15th. It is important that the Congress and the American people have confidence in DoD's management of every taxpayer dollar.
You're the captain. You're responsible for this ship. Accountability is important because that's how you're going to get leverage. That's how you're going to get credibility. It's also how you're going to get equity. You're going to get a piece of the business.
Okay, let's fast forward and check in on those annual audits. Audit number 1 in 2018 was a fail. That's okay. Sometimes it takes a second to get our shit together. 2019, another fail. Maybe 2020 is the year. Nope. But hey, we could pass around 2027. That's a full decade after the annual audits began, and this is the Pentagon. Intelligence is supposed to be their thing. Anyway, while the Pentagon was busy failing audits and giving us lip service about it, Skidmore continued his forensic accounting research of the budget. In reviewing the financials for fiscal years 2017, 2018, and 2019, he discovered accounting adjustments that far surpassed the $21 trillion mark in each year. Unsupported adjustments in that 3-year period alone adding up to almost another $95 trillion. And when we add that to the $21 trillion from 98 to 2015, we're at $115 trillion. Shockingly, most of the legacy media chose not to pick up this story at the time. Bloomberg did run an article in January of 2020 where Anthony Carpaccio pointed out the Department of Defense made $35 trillion in accounting adjustments in 2019, easily surpassing the $30.7 trillion in such adjustments recorded in 2018. You probably caught me flash a screenshot of a fact check during the Rumsfeld clip where the fact checkers flagged the headline as misleading with a misleading headline. Had the legacy media picked up the $115 trillion, they likely would have done the same thing. And obviously, since $115 trillion far exceeds the total debt, total GDP, and the total supply of money combined. So losing that much money isn't really reasonable, which begs the question, what is going on? What are they doing with our money, and why don't they want us to know? To even begin to understand this problem, we've got to dig a little bit deeper into accounting adjustments. Investopedia defines an adjustment as an entry in a company's general ledger that occurs at the end of an accounting period to record any unrecognized income or expenses. So it's shit we spent money on or got paid for that we don't recognize or cannot document. Let's check in with the good old Government Accountability Office for their thoughts. Adjustments the DoD frequently makes, including forced balance adjustments to make its financial systems agree with Treasury balances, don't have adequate supporting documentation. The agency's financial mismanagement has been on our high-risk list since 1995. Killing it, GAO. That's like an entire generation. Good thing we're paying for you to look out for us. Moving on, Wikipedia refers to these unsupported accounting adjustments as plugs. Bookkeeping should account for all numbers during reconciliation. However, discrepancies can occur, for example, due to data entry or rounding errors. Yeah, maybe someone just keeps accidentally adding 3 zeros to shit. Plugging has been described as the use of false numbers in financial ledgers that forces balances and effectively masks accounting errors and control deficiencies. And the consequence? Plugging will make an analysis unreliable, resulting in a flawed ratio analysis, performance analysis, equity valuation, budget, loan appraisal, and debt structure, rendering every single tool we have to determine financial accountability worthless, resulting in a double fail, stacking risk layers and exceeding the threshold of any rational investor. Since that's not us, let's keep going. An organization may use a plug when it's not cost-effective to search for a small mistake. The acceptability of a plug depends upon the amount. A plug must be immaterial in order to be justified. So let's go back to Skidmore. Focusing on fiscal year 2019, $35 trillion in accounting adjustments is 47 times the $738 billion in authorized DoD funding that year, and 1.6 times the U.S. GDP of $21.4 trillion. I.e., the opposite of immaterial, the enormity of the accounting adjustment defies any rational explanation. If we attempt to put this into context, it'd be like earning an annual salary of $50,000 with $2.35 million moving in and out of your account throughout the year, and not knowing where the money came from or what you spent it on. Broken down monthly, it'd be like earning $4,200 with another almost $200,000 going in and out of your account that month, having no idea what from. Let's put our boomer hats on for a minute and do something that our ancestors used to do. Balance the checkbook. It's the end of the month. We've recorded every single cent we've spent in our transaction register. We've got our calculators out ready to open up the bank statement and make sure everything lines up. Super confident in our math and recording skills, expecting our bank statement to match the $2,500 balance we show. Imagine our surprise when we open it up to find that our account is $193,000 overdrawn. And then we rack our brains trying to figure it out. Did we eat out a lot this month, or buy a couple boats? Buy a house? For the life of me, I can't remember. Now I have to add an adjustment for $195,000 in order to reconcile the statement balance. In this day and age, it is entirely plausible for someone to have a lucrative side hustle or an expensive addiction causing fluctuations 50 times the amount of their income. But whatever that thing is, it's not operating beneath their awareness. And if that's what they tell you, you don't have to be a risk expert to discern that they're likely up to no good. Moving on to the DoD's most recent audit, the fiscal gymnastics continues. In 2023, the Pentagon failed its 6th audit in a row, claiming progress is sort of beneath the surface, continuing on to not state if they would ever see a clean audit. Our money isn't the only thing they can't find. Apparently, they do know what they spent some of it on, but they can't find most of that shit either. The 2023 audit revealed that they couldn't account for 63% of nearly $4 trillion in assets. The Defense Department said about 1,600 auditors worked on the 2023 audit, which cost $187 million, a reduction from the $218 million that it cost in 2022. So we're spending like $200 million a year to not find the missing $100 trillion. Part of the reason the Pentagon keeps failing audits is because it can't keep track of its property. The missing assets include parts, equipment, buildings, and partial F-35s. It's okay though, because failing their 6th audit in a row is apparently a teachable moment, so we should probably feel pretty good about it. Despite not knowing where trillions of dollars are, the chief comptroller for the Pentagon says the department can learn from the audit's findings. Specifically, American aid to Ukraine provides a chance for the department to see why it matters that every item and dollar are accounted for. We'll get to the whole sending money we don't have to other countries while the people that paid into the system are suffering rabbit hole in a minute, but can we just take a second and process the fact that this is real and maybe reflect on why the constitutional mandate to keep track of our dollars didn't matter to the Pentagon until we started sending it to Ukraine? There is one thing the Pentagon didn't lose, and that is our trust. According to them, we remain a trusted institution, and we recognize that we have the obligation to do everything to maintain that trust, McCord said. Nothing says I'm trustworthy like me saying I'm trustworthy. He went on to baselessly claim, we have made a lot of progress, and I look forward to our continued improvement.
Now, with Bloomberg literally running 1 million separate simulations on the outcome of this debt crisis, and 88% of them show that the debt to GDP ratio of the US is on an unsustainable path.
We could go on to dissect why we're sending welfare to wildly profitable private companies via $52,000 trash cans, $14,000 toilet seats, and $7,000 coffee makers. But 60 Minutes already did that, so let's revisit the accounting adjustments for a segue. The frequent and enormous adjustments reveal the Pentagon's weak internal financial controls, according to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation.
This shit's weak! Shit's weak! Oh.
Mismanagement of public funds could also partly explain why the U.S. defense budget is larger than the next 10 countries combined. Instead of taking Double Peter's word for it, let's research this claim. According to worldpopulationreview.com, these are the top 10 countries in military spending. And this is 2022 data. The U.S. coming in hot with $811 billion, and the next 9 countries added together coming in at $812 billion. So technically, the next 9 countries spend $700 million more than we do, at least in 2022. Looking at this same data another way, we basically spend as much on our military as the next 9 countries combined. And we're responsible for half of the top 10 countries' total military expenditure. Yay, war! One more visual representation just for grins. The dark colors representing countries that spend shit tons, which is us. Not sure why we would need to spend 3 to 10 times as much as any country that we may need to protect ourselves from, but it might explain why we also rely significantly more on individual income and property taxes than other countries. OECD countries on average raised 23.9% of total tax revenue from individual income taxes compared to 42.1% in the US, a difference of 18.2 percentage points. The OECD on average raised 5.6% of total tax revenue from property taxes compared to 11.4% in the United States. Just for reference, the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's like 38 countries that team up on global endeavors. This chart compares us against the OECD average as far as tax revenue sources. The dark blue on the left shows individual income taxes, where you can see we generate almost twice the average portion from the labor of our citizens. The green here shows property taxes, which is about the same story. And here in yellowish gold, we can see the opposite taking place with consumption taxes, where other countries on average generate twice the portion of their tax revenue from what people consume. So instead of penalizing people for earning money, they penalize them for spending money, which is arguably a better model no matter what, but especially so in a country like ours where we allow corporations to offload the vast majority of their negative externalities onto taxpayers. Earlier, we talked about how the DoD's shady accounting adjustments landed them on the GAO's high-risk list back in 1995. That list, which is updated at the start of every new Congress, identifies federal programs that are especially susceptible to fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and waste. It turns out the DoD isn't the only one exhibiting these qualities, and they aren't the only ones losing buildings.
You can't visit every federal property in the United States because nobody, not even the federal government, knows how many properties they have. That's right, America's biggest landlord has no clue how much land it lords. The U.S. government manages about 28% of the total land area of the country. On that land, there are over 1 billion square feet of real estate across anywhere from 120 to 400,000 buildings, but nobody knows exactly how many because it turns out keeping track of that is super complicated, and the government wasn't even trying to do it until 2004. That's the year President Dodgeball signed this executive order demanding the government identify and categorize all the property they own, lease, or otherwise manage. Fun fact, 77% of the buildings in the dataset as of 2020 didn't even have addresses listed. In 2015, agencies reported about 7,000 empty or underutilized buildings, and recent estimates have it at 10 times that.
And this may not come as a surprise, given that government inefficiency is one of the most memed things on the internet, and is one of the few things that we actually have a long history of all agreeing upon. And while it's less nefarious than a lot of the things we're about to discuss, this level of inefficiency probably isn't something we should be so willing to tolerate. Before we leave the topic of shady accounting and missing money, we have to cover the bank bailouts during the housing crisis. Technically, the Fed isn't part of the government, but since they use us as collateral to finance their spending addiction, we incur the debt, the interest on the debt, and pay their inflation tax, so their accounting practices are a determining factor in our level of risk. To refresh our memories, let's visit Federal Reserve history, where they define the subprime mortgage crisis as the period of time between 2007 and 2010, where the expansion of mortgages to high-risk borrowers coupled with rising house prices contributed to a period of turmoil in financial markets. Most people remember spending $700 billion to rescue the too-big-to-fail banks. But it turns out that number was a lie. Even worse, the $700 billion in TARP loans ended up being dwarfed by more than $7.7 trillion in secret emergency lending that the Fed awarded to Wall Street. Loans that were only disclosed to the public after Congress forced an extraordinary one-time audit of the Federal Reserve. The extent of this secret bailout didn't come out until November 2011, when Bloomberg Markets, which went to court to win the right to publish the data, detailed how the country's biggest firms secretly received trillions in near-free money throughout the crisis. Then $7.7 trillion turned into $16 trillion. The Special Inspector General for TARP's summary of the bailout says that the total commitment of government is $16.8 trillion, with the $4.6 trillion already paid out. Yes, it was trillions, not billions, and the banks are now larger and still too big to fail, but it isn't just the government bailout money that tells the story of the bailout. This is a story about lies, cheating, and a multifaceted corruption, which was often criminal. If you don't know who the Special Inspector General for TARP is, it's SIGTARP. Their mission is to
prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse, and promote economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability in EESA programs,
which are government programs designed to promote housing stability. And clearly they're killing it, because the American dream has never been more of a reality. Basically, it's another accountability agency that we're funding. So like if the GAO and FinCEN had an equally useless baby, it would be SIGTARP. We need to sage and sidebar again really quick and talk about interested party oversight. An entity cannot oversee itself. That's risk 101. You wouldn't hire your baby to babysit your baby. Funding government agencies to oversee government activities is utterly ridiculous. We're literally trying to solve our problem of throwing money out of windows by throwing more money out of more windows. And these aren't just committees, they're full-blown agencies. The GAO alone employs over 3,000 full-time employees. When we humans have a vested interest in something, we cannot be trusted to make unbiased decisions. We are biologically wired for survival, like it's hard-coded in our DNA, which means we will act in self-preservation. No one knows this better than the government, which is probably why they try to describe the Government Accountability Office as independent, even though they go on to say it's totally part of the government. The U.S. Government Accountability Office is an independent, nonpartisan government agency within the legislative branch that provides auditing, evaluative, and investigative services for the U.S. Congress. It is the supreme audit institution of the federal government of the United States. It identifies core mission values as accountability, integrity, and reliability. It is also known as the Congressional Watchdog. They certainly don't act like it, but I would postulate that the government is one of the world's foremost experts on risk. Between Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, and RD, the government backed like 90% of residential mortgages after the housing crisis. They possess the most comprehensive and robust data on fraud and financial risk in existence, which they use to write the underwriting guidelines and operate the automated underwriting engines that determine whether you are worthy of a mortgage. And those underwriting guidelines are filled with requirements for independent validations, third-party verifications, interested party risk conditions, non-arm's length transaction requirements, conflict of interest guardrails. They don't trust you for shit. Risk is highly predictable, and they have it down to a science. If you tried to validate your own income or couldn't document 63% of your assets, they would laugh you out of the building. And if you had unsupported adjustments 50 times the amount of your income on your asset statements, they'd probably file a SAR and report you to FinCEN. They've even managed to corrupt their third-party oversight agencies with shady interested party conflicts. Why would we trust them to oversee themselves? Remember earlier when we talked about corruption being an emergent property of competitive market dynamics? This is what market capture looks like. If we were intelligent, we would pull taxpayer funding from all oversight agencies. Let pharma fund the FDA, just keep them away from public policy. Let doctors get back to patient-centered medicine. These broken agencies aren't just costing us money, they're depriving patients of life-changing treatments because doctors are handcuffed by the medications that pharma has bribed the FDA to approve. Like hyperbaric oxygen, which is threatening to shatter the narrative that stroke recovery isn't possible after a certain amount of time, and patients in the UK have been swearing by for nearly 50 years. Despite its potential to give people some of their lives back, doctors don't offer it because the FDA can't be bothered to approve it despite over 4,000 studies and their own claims that it's generally safe and complications are rare on their website. It's oxygen. It's a pressurized chamber that saturates the body with high oxygen levels and has incredible healing potential. But pharma can't patent it or make it in the lab, so sorry, stroke patients. The FDA can't approve oxygen for you, but they can approve opioids.
Powerful new opioid that's hitting the market. The FDA just approved a drug called Disuvia, saying the drug fills an important but limited unmet medical need.
It's strong. It's about 1,000 times more powerful than morphine.
Projected annual sales of this drug with $1.1 billion.
Wow.
It has a more rapid route of administration than, let's say, intravenous or IV drugs. Risks: any drug in the opioid class suppresses respiration.
It can stop your breathing. That can happen the first time. It can be fatal. Potential for abuse is there.
A life-saving move from the FDA.
For the first time in history, the FDA has approved an over-the-counter version of Narcan.
Drug overdoses are the leading cause of accidental deaths in America, killing more than 107,000 people in 2021, according to the CDC. More than 80,000 of those deaths involved opioids, and overdoses among teens aged 14 to 18 now reaching a record high, surging 133% in just 2 years.
One of the areas we regulate is pain medicine. This is a glimpse of the current landscape of the opioid crisis in the U.S. and illustrates the increasing rate of national overdose deaths involving any opioid. The opioid crisis began in the late 1990s. Numbers continue to rise. In 2021, there were over 80,000 opioid overdose deaths, and even more recent data from the CDC show that the numbers continue to increase.
I could spend days documenting the suppression of effective therapies, the distribution of lethal therapies, the FDA's role, and the big pharma rabbit hole of criminal behavior. Like that one time when Bayer gave kids AIDS.
Bayer Corporation, the rat of the week. Internal documents show that after this company positively, absolutely knew that they had a medication that was infected
with the AIDS virus, they took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The medicine's called Factorate. It was an injection medicine that was used for hemophiliacs, mostly children.
But it's really depressing and we have a lot to cover, so I'll just leave this here and again say this is regulatory capture. This is the price we pay for allowing our government to fall into the hands of the market. Back to the subprime mortgage crisis and the bank bailouts, which have now moved from 16 trillion to 29 trillion. To be clear, I have no idea what this number actually is, and I don't really give a shit. We do know that it's definitely not the $700 billion figure that we were initially given by Congress. We know that the Fed lied about it. We know that an audit was forced on them and someone found 7.7 trillion. Then we know that the 16 trillion number came from the SIGTARP babies report, so it came from our own government. There are multiple reports up to 29 trillion, but I'm tired of researching this, so let's just stick with the government's $16 trillion figure. There's a little problem with it. This graph here shows the total outstanding mortgage debt in the United States each year from 2001 to 2023. The Fed defines the housing crisis from 2007 to 2010, so if we isolate those years, 2007 was the largest, so we'll use that year. We come up with 11.24 trillion total outstanding mortgage debt on family residences in the United States. If we bring back our easy graph and chart that number against SIGTARP baby's Fed bank bailout estimate, the purple line is bigger than the blue line, which means we could have used this 16.8 trillion to pay off every single outstanding mortgage for every single homeowning American and still had 5.4 trillion left over. Which begs the question once again, what is going on? The numbers I'm using are really conservative. Let's check in with the former Assistant Secretary of HUD for her take.
Indeed, the bailouts during the financial crisis required $24.7 trillion in loans and bailouts, according to the TARP Inspector General. That's more than 3 times what would have been required at the time to retire all the single-family residential mortgages in the United States. So we know it was more than a housing bubble.
If we update our easy graph with Catherine's numbers, we've got a $16 trillion on our hands. Again, I don't know what these numbers really look like. We do know that this is when the Fed started inflating the money supply and putting us into debt for their shenanigans. I've been making videos about how useless the Fed is for a hot minute, but in researching this video, I'm learning that their uselessness is nothing compared to their shadiness.
Talk about the Fed and how utterly useless they are. Especially when they created the problems, and it's this weird Hegelian thing where we're like, oh, you did it, but also fix it, and we trust you, but we shouldn't. Sage.
When we reclaim our agency and start looking into the things that don't serve to get rid of, the Fed should be at the top of that list. It's not federal, they have no reserves, it was started under the shadiest of circumstances, and they break everything they touch. These are not things that free people tolerate.
This isn't the first time the central bank we created to protect our economy has instead led us to the brink.
Let's start at the beginning. This is not a chart of a meme stock or a crypto shitcoin. This is a chart of the US government's total debt. If we zoom in on just the last couple of decades, we can see it's done nothing but go up and is currently at $34.5 trillion.
Instead of allowing the Fed to bail out their bank buddies and member banks, securing their multi-billion-dollar bonuses, we could have bailed out the people of our country for a fraction of the cost. Only a fraction of these outstanding mortgages defaulted. So wherever all this money went, it didn't go to the people. At best, they were able to use HARP loans to refinance to a lower rate without the equity requirement. At worst, they lost their homes. While the bank execs that approved their loans and consciously chose to take on that risk put us into debt to erase their mistake and keep their bonuses. Moving on to a different depressing thing, let's bring back this chart that shows where the government sources federal tax revenue from. Remembering that America is unique and that it sources such a large portion from our wages, we can easily see that individual income taxes make up nearly half of federal tax revenue, which might reasonably lead us to believe that an equal portion is also spent on us. But that's not the case, unless you include, like, spying on us and shit.
If you boil it down and actually look at where the tax money goes, you'll see very, very little of it goes to actually helping people who need it. The vast majority of your tax dollars go to large pharmaceutical corporations, the military-industrial complex, lining the pockets of corrupt politicians and lazy bureaucrats.
Before we break down that piece of inspiration, let's quickly talk about where our federal taxes don't go. I rarely get pushback when I have these conversations with people, even boomers. It feels like another collective illusion. Pretty much everyone I talk to is starving for a way to exercise agency over this and pull the plug. But when I do, it's about this.
How would we have roads? How would a private company figure out how to buy land and lay asphalt? It's preposterous that that could happen without force.
But Jesse, don't you think it's important to fund your fire department, your police department, your school? Those services are largely funded by state and local taxes. I think it's important that we all understand which taxes pay for which things.
Thanks, Angry Me. I will take it from here. So let's start with roads. One of the primary sources for funding for roads is gasoline taxes.
These funds are allocated for building, maintaining, and improving road infrastructure. Governments also rely on revenue generated from vehicle registration and licensing fees.
States do get some federal grant money for roads, but the major source of that funding is the Highway Trust Fund, which is primarily funded by federal gas taxes. So yeah, we're paying for it, but with money that we've already paid taxes on. Meaning it is in addition to what you pay in income taxes.
Roads can also be funded by tolls and municipal bonds issued by local governments.
Let's quickly cover fuel tax. For every gallon of gas you put in your tank, 18.4 cents goes to the federal government, 24.4 cents for diesel. And depending on the state, you're paying anywhere from 8 to 61 cents per gallon. Let's move on to schools. How would we pay for those if we didn't send a third of our income to the man? Pretty much the same way we do now.
Schools are mostly funded by property and state income taxes. If you don't have state income tax, you probably have high property taxes. They can also be funded by state lotteries and sales taxes, which are the primary source of funding for schools in the U.S.
States do get a little bit of federal grant money. Most of it has strings attached.
The federal government plays a role in funding schools through programs like Title I. In 2021, 10.5% of school funding came from federal sources like Title I and the Individuals with Disabilities Act. The bulk of school funding consistently comes from a mixture of state aid, 45%, and local tax revenue, 44%.
10.5 was high due to pandemic relief aid. It's typically around 7%.
When I got to Washington, 7% of the budget, more or less, was being spent on schools. And so we said, fine, we'll support that budget. But we want to know whether it works. If your children are not reading at grade level, there will be consequences.
What an asshole. So he's talking about cutting funding to public.
The goal should be, can a person read, which is should be the major goal of education systems across the country. I was particularly concerned if they could read right.
Hey, tell me, kid, do you read right? If you're not teaching kids to read right, we're going to give you even less money.
Yeah. That's such a good skill.
Read right?
Yeah, read right.
The small portion of conditional funding that the government does reluctantly provide as long as the kids can read right mainly comes through those specific programs, which are designed for students with disabilities or who are from low-income households. But like everything else, they're broken and have found a way to increase the inequality they were designed to stop. I apologize if that section was redundant. I went to public school in America. What about police and fire? Surely they would disappear if we quit paying federal taxes. Also, no.
Emergency services are largely funded by local taxes, such as property tax and sales tax. State governments often provide grants that can be used for purchasing new equipment, training personnel, and expanding emergency services. Nonprofits and volunteers also contribute. Federal assistance can come into play when approved to support emergency services during natural disasters, emergencies, or to provide resources to help local and state governments respond to crises.
Much like our impact on public policy, our income taxes have a minuscule, statistically non-significant impact on shit we care about. Except for when they make things worse. Before I list the other hidden taxes I'm aware of, disclosure is also a pillar of evaluating risk, so let's just go ahead and mark that as a fail now in case anybody's still keeping track, even though this is starting to feel like less of a risk evaluation and more of a circus evaluation of criminals. Okay, other hidden federal taxes that I'm aware of include
airline taxes, alcohol, tobacco, firearms and ammunition, fuel, cell phone and landline, indoor tanning, and mortgage guarantee fees.
And inflation is a hidden tax when it's created by government spending or borrowing because it reduces your purchasing power. And after you pay taxes on your income, you also pay taxes on
goods and services, groceries in 13 states, state and local utilities, electricity and natural gas, insurance premiums, cable, hotel rooms, gambling, and imported goods.
Because you're so depressed about all these taxes that you're paying. After all is said and done, for most families, this leaves you with about 50% of the money that you earn going to various taxes, which means you're working about half the year just to pay the government. But it wasn't always this way.
You gonna take 40% of my paycheck in taxes? Most definitely, And then after you tax my check, you gonna tax me on anything I spend with the money left from my check that you already taxed. Oh, you getting it now, you this close. You this close to getting ready to chase the American dream. So let me get this shit straight. You gonna tax my whole check, give me what's left. Then I'm gonna spend that on something, and you're gonna tax me again for spending money that was already taxed. Or else you're gonna take it from me because I didn't pay taxes. Yes, and if you do that real hard and just pull up on your bootstraps with all your might, you'll make it in this country. Bro, that sounds like some fucking bullshit. If I gotta pay taxes on anything that exists forever, anytime, always, every day, or else I'm getting my shit took or go to prison, do I own anything? No, y'all don't own shit. It's just a big lending system. We own everything and we just sell you the illusion that you got something. You don't have shit. Miss a tax payment, I'm taking that shit. Miss another one, you're going to prison. Don't like it, leave.
Where do your federal taxes go? Largely, they go to pay interest on national debt. So our bondholders, when you purchase a bond, you are effectively lending that entity money. So who is purchasing our bond market? Those are the people that we owe money to with the bond market, i.e. the debt market, i.e. how we raise funds to pay our bills that we can't afford with taxpayer dollars because no one checks the state.
Who owns the bond market? Who are the largest stakeholders? So there's China. Above that, there's Japan. And then above that, there's the Fed, which is our central bank.
So our central bank is the largest stakeholder, loaning us money to pay our bills now. Where are they getting the money to buy those bonds, to lend to us? Turns out that's actually a really dope question.
Is it just a big lending system exploiting half of our labor? It kind of is, if you ask me. So when we want to buy a house, we go to a bank and borrow money. When banks aren't liquid enough to meet the reserve requirements to make that loan, they borrow money from the Fed. Then when the government comes to the Fed begging to borrow money because they suck at managing their finances or they need to send a bunch of money to another country to buy weapons to kill kids in countries that they're mad at, and the Fed doesn't have the money to lend because it's tied up to pretend the banks have enough liquidity to make our loans, they just print a bunch of money to buy government bonds, which is the same thing as lending the government money, which is also the same thing as our national debt, which means we are the collateral for the money the Fed made up to lend to our government. So in a roundabout way, we are the collateral for the money that the banks borrow to then turn around and lend to us, which is part of the reason we are $34 trillion in debt and a large driver of the rampant inflation tax we are paying. And it's kind of like we owe the same debt twice. I get that this can all be pretty confusing. Thankfully, my girl Bree intuitively sent me this clip from Jared Bernstein at the perfect time to break this all down for us. Bernstein was the chief economist and economic advisor to Biden during the Obama administration, and in February of last year, Biden nominated him to serve as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. I'm sure he will do a much better job of explaining
like
this.
You said, they print the dollar, so why does the government even borrow? Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do?
Uh-oh.
They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah, so a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to, I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, cause it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
I was admittedly in tears laughing when I first saw this clip, and initially I followed it up with a bunch of memes demonstrating the current level of incompetence amongst current U.S. leaders. But I deleted it because it's not funny. The Council of Economic Advisors is an organization of leading economists who advise the president on matters of economic, monetary, and fiscal policy. One of their main roles is to prepare the annual economic report of the president, an important vehicle for presenting the administration's domestic and international economic policies. The report is written by the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, so Bernstein. It overviews the nation's economic progress and is transmitted to Congress no later than 10 days after the submission of the budget. We are $34 trillion in debt, and the report that Congress is using to budget our spending is written by a dude who doesn't understand the fundamental mechanism of the U.S. bond market, how we incur that debt. Like, he doesn't even know if we're lending or borrowing, and it's debt.
The government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds.
These are the people
flying the plane. It's fine. Everything's fine.
Get that kind of sinking feeling that, uh-oh.
That the plane's crashing? Yeah, maybe we can just print our way out of it. You guys remember Greenspan?
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that.
What does that lead to? You guys are getting smart. What does that lead to? Inflation.
So there is zero probability of default.
So that devalues your dollar in every single investment that you hold.
We all know how inflation works, right? You see a central bank like the Federal Reserve print $3 trillion in 2020, and suddenly, out of nowhere that nobody expected, we have record-breaking inflation. The pickle that the government is in, $34 trillion in debt, $1.2 trillion spending just on the interest on that debt this year. Next year, that's going up to $1.7 trillion. At the current pace, it's going to get to the point where every dollar that they take in taxes is going to be spent on just the interest on the debt. You get to that point and basically you default, as long as you're not the US government. So what the US government will do is it will lean on the Federal Reserve.
In this video, Joe explores the potential that the government will attempt to inflate the debt away. It is worth the watch. This is another topic I could spend hours breaking down, but I won't. One thing to take note of is that the interest on federal debt is moving towards $1.7 trillion, which is also equal to the federal deficit and the total discretionary outlays in 2023. So really their options are to default, to inflate it away, or to tax us even harder.
Here's a true fact that sounds completely made up. As of December 2022, more than half the people who earn six figures in the US reported living paycheck to paycheck.
I start us with a question. Do we love our children? Sounds like an illegitimate question, right? Well, I'm going to try and convince you otherwise. Essentially, as we go down generations, we're seeing that for the last 2 generations, people are making less money on an inflation-adjusted basis. In addition, the cost of buying a home, the cost of pursuing education continues to skyrocket. So the purchasing power, the prosperity, is inversely correlated to age. Simply put, as we get younger, we're taking away opportunity and prosperity from our youngest. The social contract that is now no longer in place, and for the first time in the U.S.'s history, a 30-year-old is no longer doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. This is a breakdown in the fundamental agreement we have with any society, and it creates rage and shame. As a result, people over the age of 55 feel pretty good about America, but less than 1 in 5 people under the age of 34 feel very good about America. Generally speaking, young people have a warranted envy, they're pissed off, and they're angry that they don't enjoy the same spoils and prosperity that were provided to our generation.
This has resulted in an enormous transfer of wealth, where people over the age of 70 used to control 19% of household income versus people under the age of 40 used to control 12.
Their wealth has been cut in half. This isn't by accident, it's purposeful. All right, this all adds up to a bunch of graphs all headed up and to the right. And what are they? What's the first one? That's self-harm rates, which have exploded, especially among girls, since my colleague Jonathan Haidt pointed out it's really gone crazy since social went on mobile. What's the next one? Teens with depression. Obesity, way up. By the way, the industrial food complex wants to addict you to fatty food so they can hand you over to the industrial diabetes complex. Overdose deaths, way up. Deaths of despair. When I was in high school, it was drunk driving. Now it's kids killing themselves. If you acknowledge that our kids are the most important thing in our lives, that everything else we do here is meaningful, but our kids' well-being and prosperity is profound. If you acknowledge that they're doing more poorly than previous generations, if you believe there's a chance that the illusion of complexity has done nothing but provide cloud cover for the unbelievable transfer of goodwill, of well-being, and of prosperity from young to old, then I present to you the following question. Do we love our children?
There's an endless list of discussions that I hope
this video
ushers in, but I'll round this one off with one I find especially important. Suicide is the leading cause of death for kids ages 11 to 17 in my state. It's a leading cause of death for young people across the entire country, and the numbers are only getting worse. We have built a world that children want to escape, and if that's not signal that we're off track, I don't know what is.
Suicide is the second leading cause of death in his age group. In my state, it's the first. It's the third leading cause of death for 15 to 24-year-olds, and it's last, but it made the list of the 10 leading causes of death for ages 5 to 9. More teenage young adults die from suicide
than each of these causes combined.
Things haven't improved in the last 26 years. The numbers are going in the wrong direction. We aren't just building a world that people want to escape. We're building a world that children want to escape. It's uncomfortable to think about taking collective accountability for suicides and overdoses, but the uncomfortable truths don't stop there. We continue to find new ways to leave people behind.
Open your eyes.
So we talked about in the first video how this corporation, this potential investment, has one job: to protect our freedoms and to make sure shit doesn't get too far. Maybe that's 2 jobs. I don't know.
We've talked a lot about where our taxes don't go, and so far the government has failed pretty much every financial risk metric hard. But aside from the waste and obscurity, are they managing to deliver on their commitment? To determine that, we need to clearly define what that commitment is. So let's fact check Angry Me. What are we paying them for? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution provides Congress with broad authority to lay and collect taxes for federal debts, the common defense, and the general welfare of the United States. That last part feels important. Summarizing this into bullet points that we can quickly reference, Congress collects taxes to pay our debt, to provide for our defense, and to provide for our general welfare. Seems simple enough. Let's see how it's going. We've pretty well covered the debt scenario, considering we currently owe all of the money that there is, plus another $14 trillion, and that the interest on our debt, which we already can't pay, is about to be equal to the amount we already spend in appropriations, which is coincidentally the same amount we overdrew our bank account by last year. I think we can go ahead and mark this one a fail, and move on to defense spending, which we've also pretty well covered, but to recap, at least half of our discretionary tax dollar budget goes towards defense. We also spend as much as the next 9 countries combined on our military and are responsible for half of the top 10 countries' military spending overall, and we can't find more than half the shit we spend it on. I don't think overachieving is a win here, so let's go ahead and mark that a fail and move on to general welfare, which also brings us to the strong T, or the risk of harm. For this section, I'm going to ask you to open your hearts along with your minds. This is the part where I think we really need to take an honest look and decide if this is who we want to be. We're in this together, all of us, and we have the agency to do something about it. We just have to decide to.